Research Seminar, which is made in cooperation with the European Higher Education Sector Observatory. We have a very distinguished speaker, Friedrik Piro, Senior Researcher at NIFU, Nordic Institute for Research and Innovation. And I see also at least one of his co-authors, Marco Seber. Hello, Marco. The paper will deal with regional and sectoral variation in the attractiveness of funding from the European Union framework programs, and is based on extensive exploitation of the RISIS EU Pro database and other data on European programs. As usual, we will have a presentation by Niklas. I ask you to try to stay within 30-35 minutes so that we have time for discussion. Then we have a highly distinguished discussant, Thomas Scherngell from the Austrian Institute of Technology, and then we open the floor for discussion and further deepening. So Niklas, the word and the screen is to you.
Okay, thank you. I would like to share my screen. Let's see, where is that? Share screen.
And in the meantime, of course, mute your micro. You can ask questions also during the presentation, maybe raising your hands on the chat. We love having you the camera open sometimes so that presenters see people not names. So if you can leave your camera open, we might see some people drinking, eating, and doing other activities, but we are sure your brain is with us fully.
So, can you see my presentation now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
And one moment. And now you can see the big screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation. You said the title, I'd like to repeat it. It's called Regional and Sectoral Variations in the Ability to Attract Funding from European Union's 7th Framework Program and Horizon 2020. And this is based on a paper that I have co-authored with Professor Marco Seber from University of Agder in Norway and Lily Wang from Maastricht University in the Netherlands. We've been working for a long time with this paper, and finally, last month, we had it accepted for publication in Scientometrics. So I hope it will be in the next issue. Before I begin, I would just like to show where we are. I am sitting in my office at NIFU in Oslo. Marco is in Kristiansand in Norway. And Lily from Maastricht is not here today. She's on a holiday. So we made this paper together. But the background, or at least my inspiration for doing this work at all, was that I'm a bit curious about how the funding of EU FP funds is distributed across Europe. Because here in Norway, there's a lot of expectations that it's more skewed and concentrated than what some people may think. I hear all the time that in the ERC, Norway is doing bad, and it's no problem really, because everyone knows that it's only researchers from Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the UK, and possibly also Israel that gets ERC funding. And there's also a common view, I think, among many people that most of these funds from the EU are concentrated in Germany, France, Netherlands, UK, and so on. So we wanted to explore this a bit further. EU FP funding is very high up on the public agenda in Norway, in the ministries and in the Research Council of Norway. And every time Norway gets an ERC grant, for example, it's a big issue, always in the newspapers. But some of Norway's biggest projects, that's not obviously not ERC, but it's also not in universities. It's in research institutes, which may not be in Oslo or Bergen or any of the major cities. And some of Norway's largest projects in Horizon 2020 doesn't have involvement from research institutions or higher education institutions at all. They're being held in public agencies, municipalities, and so on. So the EUFPs is a very, it's not only about universities, although most of the focus here in Norway is about universities when we talk about European research projects. Every year, in Norway, we have national reports from the Ministry of Science, from the Research Council of Norway, where it's a big focus on how Norway is doing in the framework programs compared to other European countries. But what we are interested in is to look not at countries, but at what's happening within countries, because there could be huge variations in a country in what's going on in terms of European research projects. So our focus here is on the regional differences. The aim of our study has been to study geographical and sectoral differences in the capability to attract funding from the European framework programs and how it has changed over time. To do so, we will use project, but also proposal data from FP7 and Horizon 2020 to explore whether the distribution of European funding has converged or diverged across European regions from the one program to the next. It's a study which draws upon a very large data set. In total, we are studying 20,000 projects that was funded in FP7 and 28,000 Horizon 2020 projects. And as you can see on the bottom line, these projects, again, they come from a total of 125 and 248,000 proposals submitted to these two research programs. Now, when we talk about convergence and divergence, we see that in light of the European Commission's efforts towards cohesion, because EU's cohesion policy, the structural funds, accounts for, I think, 1/3 of the total EU budget. But the research programs, the framework programs, have not traditionally been about cohesion. It's been about scientific excellence and economic competitiveness in Europe. And also, it's a strong competition to get these kind of funds. So they're based on excellence rather than cohesion. But I just read, there was a report which said that in 2021 to 27, which is now and in the future, the EU are going to try to look for synergies between these structural funds and the capabilities of regions to develop strong R&D environments, and that this should be incorporated in Horizon Europe. But we think that this tension or contradiction between excellence and cohesion is very interesting and possibly conflicting issues. Now, when it comes to study EU FP success or participation, I think there's two main strands of research which we draw upon to frame our study. The first is related to participation in terms of volume, or you can call it success, and it is foremost something that's being studied at the institutional levels and mostly in higher education institutions. Benedetto Lepori himself have made one of these papers that we have used a lot. The main conclusions from this strand of research is that there's a strong concentration of funding in certain institutions and certain countries in Europe. And there's also a strong pre-selection among potential applicants, foremost related to applying for ERC grants. And the second strand of research is about how the framework programs have contributed to the widening of the European research networks and the European research area. And here, Thomas Scherngell, who's also here today, has made several papers which we have made, which has been very useful to us in understanding how Europe has evolved in its research collaboration. But what we think is missing in all the studies that we have come across is a sectoral perspective. There's hardly anything about differences between sectors in a country or a region. So our aim has been to challenge or complement previous studies about how EU funding is distributed by looking at regions rather than countries or institutions. Look at sectors and not just total for a region. I can give one example from Norway. Norway's three largest regions in terms of participation in European research is Oslo, where I live. Here, practically all the funding goes to the higher education sector. Trøndelag, which is a region in the mid of Norway, or the northern parts of Norway, is foremost characterized by very strong involvement from research institutes. And it's here where we find Norway's largest research institution, which is called SINTEF. And then there's a region that you don't know about, but it's called Viken. It's the areas that surrounds Oslo. There are several universities here, but this is a region where practically all the EU funding goes to private companies. So each sector has their distinct profile and institutions that are important in acquiring EU funding. Also in our study, we would like to make sure that we don't compare apples with bananas or something. So we need to make some size adjustments of the regions, because comparing London as a region to the north of Norway with some 100,000 inhabitants makes a really bad comparison. In Accorda, which is what we use, that's where we find project and proposal data from FP7 and Horizon 2020. There's a very clean file of all projects and all project participants. The proposal file is not clean nor standardized. So in order to distribute funding across regions, we had to work really hard for a very long time to get all the regional affiliations of all applying institutions correct. And this is what we have done. So in the EU system, Accorda, the database, the participants in proposals and projects are split into 5 different sectors. The higher education sector, which has 34% of the project participations and 40% of the funding. Then you have the research institutions, such as NIFU, where I live, IIT in Austria, where Thomas is from, 26% of the overall funding. Then you have the private sector, the private companies, which I will call PRC from now on. They have 26% of the overall funding. Public sector, 3%. Now, in Norway, the Research Council of Norway belongs to the public sector because its only mission is to distribute funding. But in France, Italy, Spain, and so on, these research councils belongs to REC category, the research institutions. And then we have 3% of the funding, which goes to the category other, which is a mix of NGOs, various organizations, such as patient organizations, and so on. In our study with our sectoral approach, we will only include 2 of these sectors, which is the higher education sectors and the private sector. This is a bit unfortunate. We would ideally like to have the research institutions here, the REC sector, but it was methodologically not possible because it's a huge problem in these EU data to decide the location of the institutions. For example, I think all projects for the French Research Council are listed as being carried out in Paris, which is not true. They're spread all over France. It's the same in Italy, it's the same in Spain, and it's also the same in most Eastern European countries where you have Academy of Sciences, which constitute several research institutes all over the countries. So for this sector, we were not able to correctly assign projects to the regions of the countries, so we have to leave it out. The public sector and the other category is not really relevant to us, as I will come back to, because what we're going to do is to adjust each region for their full-time equivalents of research staff taken from Eurostat. And these 2 categories, public and other, they do not carry out research in a way that makes it classified in Eurostat. So at the regional level, we have chosen to look at NUTS 2, which has a political function, because NUTS 2 is the level that the European Commission is using as a yardstick to measure inequalities across Europe. So this is the targeted, the intervention level, so to speak. In total, we have 276 NUTS regions from 31 countries, and we have included Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina at the national levels for our study. We chose NUTS 2 also because NUTS 1 would mean too few regions, and NUTS 3 is sometimes, I don't know how meaningful it really is, such as London, which is split into 32 units. So we believe NUTS 2 was the correct level of analysis here. Then we have normalized for the data by the number of researchers, full-time equivalents. This is from Eurostat. We conceptualize success in relation to a region's research potential as expressed by its personnel in research and development. Meaning our important indicator is regional funding attracted per FTE researcher. The purpose of this, of course, is to avoid that the funding across regions are determined by the size only. We wanted a capita indicator for our analysis. Furthermore, we're going to look at budgets and not project counts. In Accorda, you can see, and it's also online if you Google a European project, how much of the funding of a project that goes to each partner. And for each partner, we have the NUTS2 location, so we can split the money across the regions. We think this is a better way to do it than to simply count projects, because it says something about the degree of involvement. Now, there's a huge difference between being in a project with 30,000 euro or being the coordinator of the whole thing with maybe 2 million euros, right? So I would say in this project, between NIFU, IIT, and the Italian University in Lugano, we should not count all three as one. We should count them as their proportion of the budget. Success rate is also a measure that we have been trying to avoid, because it takes no difference at all into whether it's a small or big project, whether you're the coordinator or whether you're a partner, or and so on. So that's why we think that budget numbers is the best indicator about the magnitude and the degree of involvement in a research project. So before I get to the results, sorry? Okay. So what we do is to propose to conceptualize success in relation to region's research capacity as expressed by its R&D personnel and split by sectors. And the whole splitting up in sectors made a lot of sense, because when we measure the capability to attract EU FP funds between sectors, there's no correlation at all. So it means that these two sectors by large work independently in most regions and in most countries. I might have expected it would be the opposite. I'm thinking about regions like in Netherlands with Eindhoven, with the university and the Philips company. But by large in Europe, there's no relationship between how your higher education sector and how your industry or private sector is doing. So just to give some descriptive first, this is for the higher education sectors of Europe. And it shows the funding attracted per researcher's FTE in NUTS2. Now, to the right, you see that the two Irish regions have an extremely high level of funding attracted per FTE. Netherlands, second to the right, is also extremely high, but also with very large variations between the Dutch regions. And to the left, you see that there are some countries in the Eastern Europe who have systematically low levels of funding attracted in the higher education sector, but also France. And the first time I presented this at the conference, a person from a French ministry came to me and said that I thought she was going to be angry that I've done something wrong or put France in a bad light or something, but she said that she recognized this, saying it's a huge problem in France to have the university to apply for funding, and that they were trying to have them more actively involved in proposal work. When we go to the private sector, it's a very different picture. Now we see that the countries with the highest levels of funding attracted per researchers are not from Ireland, Netherlands, UK, and so on. It's from the Mediterranean countries, Italy, Croatia, Portugal, and Greece. Very high levels of funding attracted per researcher FTE. Sadly, here we also see that these some of the Eastern European countries are found to the left with the lowest levels, and also France. So this is a heat map. I think you understand this. The darker the colors, the more money you attract per FTE. And do remember, this is per FTE. It's not absolute numbers. Looking at the private sector to the right, this is confirmed to the other slide that I showed. It's the dark colors of the Mediterranean countries are not existent on the left for the higher education sector. Where we find the strongest concentration of funding on the left side in the higher education sector is in this area, the blue banana, stretching from London through Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and down to the northern part of Italy. So the funding is very unevenly distributed between these two sectors across Europe. Now, before I go to the main analysis, I'm going to show you some examples. This is how the dispersion of funding was from FP7 to Horizon 2020. ED, that's the Euclidean distance, which is a measure of dispersion. And the first observation here is that when we look at the private companies or the private sector, we see that the mean value of funding attracted has almost doubled from FP7 to Horizon 2020, which means that the money available for private companies was almost doubled from one program to the next. For the higher education sector, we see also a strong growth in funding, but nowhere as big as that seen from for the private companies. When we look at the dispersion numbers, comparing the ED normalized versus the one which is weighted and normalized, we see that in the PRC, there is less dispersion once the size of the regions is taken into consideration, which means that small regions have the most extreme values. In the higher education sector, the dispersion is by large not changed at all. It's foremost in the private sector where we see more dispersion of the funding in Horizon 2020 compared to FP7. Now this is a map that's a bit complicated. I'm going to try to explain it as best as I can, but it will be easier to understand when you read our paper. The dark gray color means that a region had high levels of funding in FP7 and has had a strong increase in the funding in Horizon 2020. So here we differ between positive and negative divergence. Positive divergence means that rich regions are getting even richer. And this is happening in the north of Europe, and it's happening in the blue banana. Negative convergence means that regions that had little in FP7 have received even less or the same only in Horizon 2020. And this is happening in large part of Eastern Europe and also in many French and Southern Italian region. So even though the overall numbers show that there is not much change in the dispersion between one program to the next, when you look at specific regions, you see that there are patterns going on here. Some regions are getting better, some are not. In the private sector, it's a very different story. The negative divergence takes place in a part of Europe stretching from France to Poland. So for the private sector, these are regions that receive comparatively little in FP7 and whose situation is not improved at all in Horizon 2020. The positive divergence, on the other hand, takes place in some northern regions and again in the Mediterranean regions. So this means that there's been a further concentration of funding in private companies in the south of Europe in Horizon 2020. And this is, like I said before, completely different to what we have observed in the higher education sector. So, but this is all based on some kind of visual inspection. So we wanted to explore these changes more systematically and more thoroughly. So we're now going to the regression analysis, where we made 4 models for each sector. That's 8 regression analysis in total. So in FP7, we look at what decides how much funding you apply for, and then what decides how much funding you receive. And both of these are standardized by the FTEs. And then we do the same for Horizon 2020. Now the variables that we put in here is the R&D FTEs, the R&D investments of a region, the research intensity of a region. All of these are based on Eurostat data. In addition to that, we have a categorical variable for regional development levels, going from low to high with transition in between. This is some classification made by the European Commission. And the last indicator we look at is the funding applied per FTE. So now I'm going to just show you the regression model, but I'm going to skip it because this is how it looks. And it's better that those of you who are interested go and see it in our paper, which is open access, by the way. So it will be available to everyone. But let me try to summarize what these tables are telling us. So this is the higher education sector. On top, you see for FP7 that the more you apply, the more you get. And it's the same in Horizon 2020. The more you apply, the more you get. And who's applying? Well, that's the regions with R&D in high levels of R&D investments. And in Horizon 2020, it's the regions with high research intensity. In addition to these three categorical variables below, it is the highly developed regions that apply a lot and that gets money. And therefore, in the higher education sector of Europe, a region's level of development, its research intensity, and its R&D investments affect the level of resources received, both directly and through the partial mediation of the amount of resources applied. So to put that a bit differently, highly developed, research-oriented, and research-intensive regions receive more funding because they apply more. And once they have applied, they have a greater chance of obtaining the funding compared to different regions. And this is very different when we look at the private sector. Here we see that the research intensity of a region is negatively associated with funding for European money. But at the same time, high levels of funding is associated with receiving more funding in both FP7 and Horizon 2020. So the funding capabilities of Southern European regions is largely explained by a very active proposal activity of these regions. Very different story from that in the higher education. I'm adding these two. I'm sorry, I should have shown them before. They were not statistically significant, but almost. But it's the same pattern. So the main findings then. We believe that regional abilities to attract funding in Europe look very different depending on which sector which is considered. In the higher education sector, it's a kind of excellent orientation. There's strong regions in the blue banana. It has been rather stable from FP7 to Horizon 2020 with a somewhat increase. And the ability to attract funding in the higher education sector depends on the levels of R&D investments, research intensity, economic development, and propensity to request funding. Now, in this excellent orientation is not present at all in the private sector. Very different story. Here, the level of investments in R&D and the research intensity is negatively associated with the level of funding applied for. Affluent, research-oriented regions in the northwest of Europe apply for lesser amount of funding compared to the east and the south. And we've seen some studies from Norway and Sweden, and maybe they're not representative to the rest of Europe, but it shows that R&D intensive and very productive firms appear less likely to apply for competitive funding and may not be as much involved in European funding proposals as they could have been. Whereas regions in the south of Europe are very capable, highly capable of attracting EUFP funding due to a very intensive proposal activity. So the south of Europe in the private sector is a bit of a success story, but also observed here is a negative divergence taking place in the Eastern European regions, which suggests that their private sector is not very successful in obtaining European funds. So this is what our paper is about. We have a big data set. We think this is a very interesting topic. We would obviously like to continue to do research on this. And there are some things we could have done in this, but there's a limit to how much you can fit into one paper. And one thing that we would like to look further into is what characterizes the institutions within a region. We don't really know who the recipients of EU funding are. Is a region driven by one, two, or a few key institutions, or are the funding evenly spread out? What's the role of having a prestigious university? What's the role of having a very large R&D intensive company, etc.? This could be explored in the future. It's also we should also try to find a way to look at the research institutes, the research council, the national research institutes of this and that, Academy of Sciences and so on. Also all these other things that we haven't really explored, like what's the impact of having science parks, close collaborations between universities and industry, etc. These are things we could potentially look into in the future. And if anyone has any other good idea or hypothesis about why funding is distributed across Europe the way it is and between the sectors, it would be very interesting to hear. So that's actually 30 minutes precisely, I think. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you a lot, Niklas.
My name is Friedrik Piro.
For keeping the time for a very interesting presentation. And as I should say, this shows the advantages of moving from aggregated data, country level data, to more disaggregated data. And you made a step, of course, towards regional data. And I think you hinted already at the end, combining regions and institutions, since data can be also analyzed at that level, would be highly interested. If you could stop sharing the screen, I would like to give the word immediately to Thomas.
Yes, I'm gonna try to find where is the stop sharing?
It's the same place as the start sharing.
Ah, there it is. Okay.
No, you are still sharing, but
am I? Okay. I'm not used to Zoom, you see. So now you can see my screen.
Yes.
Can someone guide me? I'm trying to.
Okay. Otherwise, Thomas, you can start sharing it. It will stop sharing.
I will try to share. What happens then?
Stop share. Okay.
Should work.
Okay. Yes. The word is to you. Could you go on? Okay, that's the presentation.
Thank you, Friedrik, for the very interesting presentation on a very important topic. And yeah, of course, I mean, this is a finalized study. So the comments that I will give are more to be seen as suggestions and recommendations for future research. And you have mentioned already that you want to go further in that direction. So maybe there is something that you can take up here. I mean, on a general note, clearly this is an interesting study that addresses a very important topic, both from a science but also from a policy perspective, and it comes up with an interesting data set, the eCorder database, which is not open, but it's unique in the way that you also have the information on rejected project proposals, which makes it unique in comparison to other open data sets like UPRO. And you also come up with interesting conclusions, I would say quite general conclusions in relation to your data analysis. This is something that should be discussed, I think, in future research, both your conclusion about divergent development, but also the strong differences across organization types that you mentioned. And I think this is somehow related to my view, to the main limitation of the study as it stays now, as it is largely descriptive and needs further inferential analysis, to my view, to underline or underpin the conclusions that you come up with. And I would say there are two main aspects in this context. And that is that, of course, in your inferential model, in your regression model, you do not account for a number of factors that are widely discussed in the literature as being decisive for the attractiveness of a region to participate in the framework program and to attract funding. So you may run into an omitted variable bias with your model, or at least a certain set of control variables needs to be added in order to underline or maybe put your results into perspective. And I would say there are a number of variables, but I would like to raise two main topics. The one topic is that we know very well from literature that the framework programs are networks. These are collaborative research projects. So it is also largely driven by network effects, the amount of funding or the amount of projects one organization and accordingly one region receives. This you find in earlier studies, where you find the impacts of network position on funding acquisition, the impact of partner choice of former partners, and the impact of this partner choice on the amount of funding that you get in the future. That's something that is not tested or controlled for in your study. And the other is, of course, you come up with a regional model, but don't control for spatial effects like spatial spillover effects or spatial dependence, which, of course, may be at stake here as well, and is something, for instance, in regional science or economic geography, it's extremely important from a pure statistical perspective to control for such spatial bias. And that's why probably the explanatory power is somewhat limited, and in that respect, and at least needs further, I would say, research to underline these results by controlling or accounting for these issues. This becomes probably clearer when we look at some data and methodological issues. Some of them you already mentioned on your own. So I think one big issue is that you very generally talk about convergence and divergence, but what you actually look at is convergence in higher education attractiveness versus convergence or divergence in private companies attractiveness attracting funding. So the exclusion of public research organizations really raises a robustness question when you want to generally speak about convergence or divergence. It's more than 1/3 or almost 1/3 of total funding. I think you presented that anyway. And also, you know that the distribution of participation to the framework programs is extremely skewed. So this follows a power law distribution, which means that there are some extremely important public research organizations that apply for funding and have many projects, and these are not accounted for. So you could have the case that some regions are specialized on these organizations, but they are coming up as divergent in your conclusion because you don't focus on them by excluding the public research organizations. Of course, you mentioned the problem of the headquarter bias in terms of spatial assignment. This is true, but I think it can be addressed with new possibilities from spatial imputation or by correlating it with other output variables that we have geocoded at address level, like publications or patents. Then the approach to divergence and convergence. I mean, the question is, can we really speak about convergence when we look at two extremely aggregated points in time? So this is really something we have to consider, whether it would make more sense to move from these aggregated points in time to annual observations and go to something like a Gini or to catch-up rates in order to really be able to speak about whether there is a convergence process going on. And this relates also here with the second point, that the timing of all variables really has some question marks. So you have FP7 and H2020 as very long fixed time periods, but on the other hand, you may be aware that how did you treat projects starting in the latest year of FP7, but going until, I don't know, the year 2020, everything of that is possible for the projects, and for the normalizing independent variables, you just have the time span of 2011 to 2015, which is rather short in comparison to the long time frame you have from FP7, I think 2008 to 2020. And this also may lead to problems, at least when we say, okay, here is a convergence or divergence process at stake. About the data set, of course, the big advantage of eCorder is that you have the information on rejected grant proposals, but also on the internal success scores that you did not mobilize. You have brought some explanation about it, but I think it could have been mobilized for some specific points. And also the rejected grant proposals, you did not really mobilize to a large extent. I think it is just for the mediation effect in your econometric specification. And then, of course, the question comes up about the quality of the data set, which is hardly being reproducible because it's private. So there could have been a possibility to check the cleaning and the robustness with established open research data sets that are available, for instance, in RISIS. You see the new study of Ancona, also in Scientometrics, that compares UPRO as a standard for research to test name matching algorithms, for instance. And this data set would be open and could serve also for cleaning the eCorder data. In terms of the econometric specification, this is related to what I said before. You use a mediation effect. I'm not, at least it could have also been possible to take a regional success rate to build your Y variable, because then you could also directly model the outcome at the regional level and control for the spatial bias instead of the quite complex McKinnon approach that you used for modeling the mediation effect. As the one thing, and the other thing I already mentioned, the independent variables, of course, are quite few and even some of them similar. So there is space for improvement to include further explanatory variables. For instance, the number of higher education institutions and firms in the region would be extremely important, because the question is whether your normalization with full-time equivalence is really too scarce or too blurry to control for the size effect. This could have been complemented with the number of firms or regions. And then you already have mentioned also the issue of the choice of the regional breakdown. Of course, the problems you have raised, for instance, for going to NUTS 3 level or changing between NUTS 2 and NUTS 3, you are neglecting metropolitan areas and knowledge hubs. in your study. This could be taken into account in future research. Also, when you combine it with other open data sets, you can get the independent variables for these spatial areas by deriving them from the organizational level of analysis. Yeah, that's my main points. Some recommendations for the future. I think it would be really promising, and that's why I think it's really a very good starting point, the research you have done. But it would be promising to move to a more advanced, to a spatial pendulum, Durban modeling approach, for instance, for validating the conclusions that you come up with, and even for enriching the understanding, in particular on the underlying drivers for the attractiveness of funding, in particular accounting for network and spatial effects. You could also test for additional driving factors. You have mentioned it in your future perspectives anyway, derived from an organizational level data set, in particular on regional knowledge endowments like network participation, but also issues on technological diversification, specialization, or the availability of national and regional funding, which of course will be a main explaining factor why maybe some regions has no interest anymore to participate in the same intensity in the framework programs when the national funding has increased at the same time. Going in this direction would require the interlinking with some data sets that are available, and we are here in the RISIS Research Seminars that are available in the RISIS research infrastructure, for instance, the UPRO database, but also facilities like the ORG-REC or the FIRM-REC, which could be relevant then for robustness checking and name cleaning, but also technological or economic sector assignment. And the inclusion of public research organizations is really, to my view, the most essential advancement in order to bring up your conclusions to really a more general level, and for deriving policy conclusions at a more general level than just relying on higher education and private firms. I hope these are some useful comments. That's it from my side.
Thank you, Thomas. I would like to give back to Friedrik and Mark, of course, as a co-author. If you want shortly to reply, you don't need to answer to all points, of course, and then we open the floor for a more general discussion. You are muted.
Yes, okay. Thomas? Thank you very much. This is, I would love to have your slides, by the way. That would be great. I really appreciate that you've read this so carefully and done your review so systematically. I agree with you about the third sector, the one that was not there. I must say that we had it in our original paper, and unlike the private sector and the higher education sector, we saw no patterns at all in this sector. And then, to be honest, this is a pragmatic choice. We were strongly encouraged by the reviewer of Scientometrics to leave it out, which was okay. We have said that it's a limitation to our study, and ideally it should have been there. And I would like to try to study it in the future. And you had some ideas about how that can technically be done to avoid the kind of problems that we mentioned. About making more advanced analysis, yes, I agree too. I have to say, this has been it's a paper we've worked on for a very long time. It's been a massive amount of job, and there is a limit to how much we can fit into one paper. We made a quite broad analysis. You asked about whether you could talk about changes over time when you're only comparing two programs. Well, that's actually what we do, because FP7 and Horizon 2020 were two very distinct, differently programs with different missions, different priorities. So it's about how regions are capable of attracting money within one program compared to how they are capable to do so in another. And I'm not going to comment specifically on one point at a time, but just one thing for clarification. Whether a project lasts for 1 year or 7 years I don't think that's relevant. What's relevant is under which program it received its funding. So you can have an FP7 project who got the money in the last year of FP7, but kept running all the way up till now, perhaps. That will be an FP7 project to us because it was funded under the criterions and the priorities of FP7. So I disagree with you about this being a problem. Yeah. But I would very much like to go through your slides when I'm not being watched by a lot of people, and to try to see what can we do with these ideas in the future, because some of them were close to things we have been thinking about ourselves. So thanks a lot, Thomas.
Thank you.
Benedetto, can I just have one very short feedback just to the last point? I agree with you, Friedrik, about comparing two programs. That's okay. I'm just wondering whether the notion of convergence or divergence really comes to that. If you can, you see in economics, you cannot speak with 2 points in time or two observations this is a process over time. So and this is what I mainly referred to.
Okay, so thank you. Marco, do you want to add something?
Yes, so thank you for the comments, Thomas and Friedrik, for the presentation. I was more, well, I agree with the yearly analysis. That would be an enrichment. It's kind of straightforward. It's not really difficult to control whether you have a linear trend or whether you have an inversion when the new program kicks in. So definitely something that can be done. But I was also curious to know from Thomas, because he had kind of different conclusions through his works, that basically the framework programs have, contributed to widening the European research network, that from being more concentrated, it then involved larger part of Europe. So looking at different data and contracts, he got to a different conclusion, while our analysis, looking at the real amount of money, we actually find kind of divergence and more a patchwork. So I'm also curious about his opinion on these.
Yes, Thomas?
I think the main difference, Marco, is that we did never analyze the attractiveness of funding for a specific region. We always looked at networks. And there we saw that compared over longer time periods, that these lagging regions become more connected and more embedded in these networks than before. That was one of the main conclusions there. And also in the study we did, that was published actually a long time ago in the Journal of Economic Geography, we saw that for lagging regions participating in this network directly affects their probability to create more high impact co-publications with leading regions. And there we found this effect of the framework program as a chance for lagging regions to get more involved in the knowledge diffusion. But we did never say that this necessarily increases their ability to create funds or more funds in the future. So I think this is one of the ad hoc differences I can say here, from what I remember from my own studies.
So thank you. I suggest we open now the floor for more questions. Who wants to break the ice?
I think there are some specific also in the chat.
Yes, one is just about the region. I think when you say Southern Europe, is Southern, is not Eastern. The second question is about normalization. Why using R&D FTE instead of FP funding per euro R&D invested. I guess the issue is the quality of data, probably.
Mm.
And then there is a question about Hungary. You write no data. And the link to the paper, which since was asked, is already on the chat. So I don't know, Friedrik, which
I
you
don't.
want.
Yeah, I didn't understand. What was that question for me to comment on?
So I think if that person is there, Marcel Kiss, could you just ask your question? Otherwise, I'll read the question. Is there any particular reason why Budapest was wide, no data?
Okay. We have Budapest in our. I don't understand this. There is a footnote in the paper itself about the problems of matching data from Eurostat with the Hungarian regions, because they don't. There was some changes in the classification of Hungarian regions. So we have taken a small Hungarian region and coded it as the same as Budapest. This is technical. It's described in the paper how we do that, but we do have numbers for Budapest, so I don't understand.
Okay, so it may be just a missed problem of visualization.
It could be there. Yeah.
And then the other question, why not look at the framework program funding received per euro R&D invested instead of per R&D FTEs?
Yeah. We started with FTEs, and because they are available in most NUTS2 regions, we also did some correlation testing of R&D investments and FTEs, and they were quite strongly correlated, if I don't remember wrong. But the idea was that we needed a capita indicator, and it's not the people of a region that carries out research, it's the researchers. So that was the one we used, and then we came back with the investments in the regression analysis.
Okay, so thank you. Other questions? So everything seems to be clear or obscure, as I used to say. I want really to comment on your work and to really reinstate what Thomas said. It's an opening, so the paper is very interesting because it's probably the first time, and I found reading the paper, the real interest is this difference between universities and private companies, which might have deep implications also for the programs themselves, the program design, because what I infer is that, okay, in universities, you reproduce the hierarchy of university system because it's reputation based. In companies, you have this effect that the richest regions, companies probably don't need European funding and don't see European funding as very interesting because maybe of intellectual property right problems and all these kind of issues. Whereas in the southern regions, this might be the only opportunity to perform R&D. And now there are good aspects and bad aspects. One is good that it's complementary, it's supporting cohesion, which is something important. Because anyway, top companies in terms of innovation will have so much money that they don't need the European money. The other problem, the reverse, is that if the goal of European programs would be, as it used to be years ago, to put Europe in terms of innovation technology at the top, this may be not the best solution because you end up supporting cohesion, but not excellence in innovation, maybe excellence in research because the best universities are there. So this I found very, very interesting. and in a way surprising to me, because when we did the paper on universities, the conclusion was in universities, European programs are really about excellence and concentrating money. And as we used to do, we used to say, having a Greek fisherman paying research in Oxford, because the budget is proportional to the GDP and the funding goes more concentrated. But for companies, it seems to be very different. So this was really enlightening to me. But I agree that the more fine-grained analysis, including the institution, will be important. I think what Thomas said about the importance of networks would accompany nicely what you are doing, because it might say that there is this network mechanism, and then selective participation means that the companies in less developed regions stay in the consortia. So something maybe interesting is to study the composition of consortia, because if you have consortia mixed between companies and universities, what you find might mean that universities come most from the center and companies come also from the periphery. I see Marco wants to add something on.
Yeah, Benito, one point about this is you might have like some companies that specialize in attracting funds, and you have a kind of subsidy dynamics. There was a paper, for example, from Sweden that examined how less efficient companies in Sweden over time attracted more funding. You know, so you might have also these undesirable dynamics going on. So I definitely looking at the organizational level might be interesting to see, you know, where exactly this money is going, because we might assume that giving money to less affluent regions is convergence, but it depends on how this money is spent and how, you know, receive this money exactly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. And in a way, the interesting point is the interaction between organizational and regional effects. So, I mean, if in Sweden you select a less efficient country companies, this may be bad. But if instead of having a very efficient company in Sweden, you get one in Croatia, which is maybe less efficient, you might still get some goals of extending the outreach outside the core of Europe. So the dynamics plays on both space and institutions in a way.
Can I add something
Yes.
at the end? In a very early draft of this paper that I presented in Vienna at AIT some many years ago, we had a bit of a different study design. But I was looking then at the changes in what kind of programs you are submitting your proposals to at the university level. And what I found was that the best universities in Europe, defined as those that were highest ranked in the Shanghai ranking, I think it was, were increasingly submitting a larger share of their proposals to the ERC.
Yep.
But in the lowly ranked universities, they were increasingly submitting proposals to the thematic calls, the ones that are supposed to deal with major problems in Europe. So we have the best universities doing research on their own, basic research, and to tackle the big challenges and crises, you have the allegedly not so strong universities. There's a bit of a strange distribution of roles.
Yeah, I would not find it strange. I would find something I might expect. If you are on the top of the hierarchy, you have the choice, and you choose the programs which better fit your strategic orientation. If you have no choice, you end up elsewhere. But I think that's an important topic. So beyond averages, this also dynamics across programs. For example, we made a study on colleges, and of course, colleges have different profiles than universities participating to UFP. And to some extent, it might be wanted because you don't want colleges to make ERCs. You want them to make technology innovation actions. To what extent it might create issues. Any other comments or questions? Yes, and otherwise, I really think we are in something highly interesting, and which shows the power of starting to combine data and to combine levels by data matching between institutions, regions, and countries and sub-programs. So there is probably a lot of future work which will come out on this. And your paper nicely shows that disaggregating data, so going beyond the overall views by all regions, for example, but by type of actors, might lead very quickly to important observation for policymakers, which is something highly important. If there are no other comments, I want to thank the participants and to remind that the RISIS seminar series is going on. And we have already seminars scheduled for all the spring semester. So the next one, 13th of March, will be on academic seniority and scientific production by Pedro Pineda from University of Bath. And then we will have also a seminar in April about factors influencing the mission of universities, combining natural language processing of university strategies and missions with European Tertiary Education Register data. And then we have seminars in May and in June, more oriented towards technology and topics and regional analysis. So I really would like to invite you to the next seminars. All this, I want to thank Georg for organizing and Serena for ensuring the communication within the RISIS project. And especially thank you our presenters and discussant. Thank you and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.